All right, Q&A time. Answering a couple of questions here. It looks like 4 of them. So, and I've, once again, compressed these down. I'm eliminating a bunch of stuff. Why did those union guys in the shops back in the day make so much money? Okay, that's a good question. Let me explain this. Let's say that you need to hire a guy to work in your factory, and you're hiring, let's say, 500 guys, and they're all going to work on, I don't know, some kind of machine, wire draw machines or whatever, something that can't be automated, something that still has to have, a person has to be there to fix things, right? So you need to hire like 500 guys. What are the odds that those guys are ever going to be promoted to anything beyond being that guy running the machine, right? Well, if you've got 500 guys and there's only like 1 or 2 managers, let's say, the odds aren't good, right? So what happened was early on the unions recognized this. This is before the union corruption. This is when unions actually, thought about this stuff, and they said, okay, well, hold on a second here. There's no way that the guy running that machine is ever going to be promoted, and he knows it, right? He knows that every day he's going to wake up and he's going to go work at that machine for 40 years, okay? And he's never going to be promoted, so therefore he has to be able to keep up with the cost of living. Cost of living means inflation. Okay, that's the word of the century right now, is inflation, because that's how it is. So what they did is they would negotiate. They understood this. Okay, a lot of these negotiators understood the idea of inflation. They said, okay, well, you need to actually start giving this guy raises, even because you're never going to promote him, because there's nowhere for him to go. Like, he's maxed out once, and of course, once you hit 100% efficiency at your job, and you will sooner or later, I don't care what job it is you do, it doesn't make any difference, you will eventually hit 100% efficiency. When you hit 100% efficiency, the company can't just keep throwing money at you. So what the unions did was they understood this, and they said, okay, you don't have to keep throwing money at them, but they should be able to at least stay even with inflation. And there was a big marketing thing that came around in the late 80s, early 90s is when this really got pushed, where it's like, oh, the unions are destroying all these companies. No, these companies were making deals that they were writing checks that their company couldn't cash. That's what was destroying those companies. That's what it was. It wasn't the unions doing this. It was that they were promising, they were saying, okay, well, we'll keep up with inflation, but then inflation went higher than what they could actually cover. That's what ended up happening. And it happened over and over and over and over and over, right? Because remember, remember how this works, right? If you're a millennial or a Zoomer, what you heard, same thing with the Gen Xers actually, you heard go to a company and then you work hard and you'll work your way up. Well, okay, how does that work though if there's 5,000 other people being told the same thing, right? It's not mathematically possible, because like there's no such thing as permanent growth or growth in perpetuity. It doesn't work like that. Okay, eventually a company kind of maxes out, and let's say they only get maybe 1% growth or 2% growth for the entire year. Well, they can't obviously promote 5,000 people. It's just not possible. So in the meantime, you have a bunch of people that just sit there and languish for years and years and years and years and years doing these jobs. The unions recognized that way back in the day. They recognized that was a problem, and that there was no way for Phil, the wire draw machine tech, he was never going to be promoted, ever. And it had nothing to do with how intelligent he was. Had nothing to do with any. It had nothing to do with any of that. He could be a stone genius. It didn't make any difference. There wasn't enough room to do that, because the company would have had to have grown by like 5 million% for Phil to be able to be moved up into some kind of management position. Does that kind of make sense? That's why those guys had that kind of life, and that's why one of the reasons why it's actually gone, because the companies couldn't afford that any longer, because they made a bunch of promises that they had no business making those promises. They had none. But they wanted to keep the company around, so as with, just like, Charles Ponzi. Charles Ponzi wanted to keep the Ponzi scheme going, and he did everything he could to keep the scheme going, but, ultimately, math caught up with him, and the regulators finally caught up with him. The accountants caught up with him, too. Thoughts on tipping and gratuity? It seems like the gratuity thing has gotten way out of control. Okay, so the tipping and gratuity thing, that is the fault of the American consumer. You have no one to blame but yourself on this one, American consumers, because I know that's directed at Americans specifically, because Americans, we have a tipping culture. Where that comes from is now Now, back in the day, it was, like it was just a little extra, right? You kind of threw a little extra at somebody because they did a little extra for you, so you threw a little extra, and it was a perfectly normal thing, and it was considered a gratuity. That was what it was. Now it's gotten out of control, and the reason it's gotten out of control is because businesses can't raise prices to what they would need to raise them to pay people what they would need to pay them. Like, there's this squeeze that's going on, and I've spent a year trying to explain to anybody who follows my work that squeeze is just going to get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, right? Shit rolls downhill, and they're going to squeeze anywhere they can. Nobody wants to take the lifestyle cut. Some people can't take the lifestyle cut, okay? So, meaning that they're cut to the bone. There's nothing left for them to cut, right? This is the case for a lot of the younger people. Like, there's nothing really for them to cut. At a certain point, you bottom out in terms of living within your means. Where it's like, I see some of these kids that are working full time, and there's like nothing left for them to cut out of their budgets. I've seen them, right? I mean, I've had kids that have worked for me in the past, and you look at their, they come to me with budget issues, and I'll point out, like, there's not a lot for them to cut. So, because companies don't want to, in some cases, the smaller businesses can't raise those wages. Bigger companies can. Bigger companies have no excuse. They can go to Congress and say, print a bunch of money and give us a bunch of free shit, and we're gonna pay people more. They can do that, okay? Because they own all the politicians, and they can do that. They have big company privilege, if you want to think of it in those terms. But the smaller businesses don't. So the smaller businesses have no choice but to just try and figure out how to keep employees around by encouraging, like, constant gratuities, 20, 30, 20, 20, 25, 30%, tips on stuff, because they really can't afford to keep those people motivated, right? Remember, somebody has to be interested in working there because they're actually excelling or doing something in life. They're not just going to work there as slaves, right? I know that everybody wants slaves. Big companies, small companies, the natural default setting of all humanity is to want slaves to do your work for you. This has nothing to do with capitalism or communism. Like, this is just, you can stop using those words, actually. Just watch people's actions. That's what they want, okay? Everybody wants someone to show up and do the work for them so they don't have to do anything, right? That's dude, Mark Twain, Tom Sawyer, read it. What's with you and the self-help gurus? That's too big a question. I need to do another video on that entirely by itself, with me and the goddamn self-help gurus and the guys that sell all these courses. Most of my problem is with them, the way that they're selling this, and they're not telling people the whole truth about what they're getting themselves into, because it usually comes down to these real estate guys, or the guys that what they end up wanting is just lots of money out of you. Rather than them being honest with you. I'll have to do a separate video on that. Look up the false hope economy. I did a video on that, I don't know, 2-3 weeks ago or something. False hope economy. That's a lot of my problem with it. How does inflation benefit the big companies? Oh, well, okay. So if you're above inflation, that means that your competitors, your smaller competitors, are getting wiped out because they don't have that. Think of it like this: if let's say that you owned a burger restaurant, and your prices were $5 a burger, and your competitor right down the street is also $5 a burger, and then you see prices going up, your costs going up on the wholesale side, and I come in and I say, well, hey, I'll just keep subsidizing your wholesale side to where you never have to raise your retail price. Does your competitor stand a chance against you? No, he's doomed. He's doomed. He'll never compete because I'm subsidizing the back end of that, right? Now the inflation then gets pushed out into the rest of the country, and nobody realizes it. That's why you have people saying, like, why is everything costing so much money? Because a lot of folks don't understand how inflation works. Monetary inflation is what happens prior to price inflation. Price inflation happens later. That happens 2-3 years down the road. You don't feel it. It's one of these things that you don't notice it until it's too late. It's like hypothermia, right? Hypothermia, you don't notice it until it's usually too late. Like, oh man, I feel warm again. That's bad. That's if you're in cold water and you like, oh, I feel really warm. Yeah, that's bad. That means that you're probably knocking on heaven's door. Okay, so that's how inflation works. So these companies benefit because they have the benefit of getting money subsidized to them before the competitors. So they benefit from all that. I hope that answers all your questions.